Welcome, everybody. Good morning. Some people, it probably isn't even morning. We're here from all around the world. Welcome to the second in our series of 4 virtual conversations on compassionate systems change in higher education. We see this series as a key step toward building a lively research community of leaders in educational innovation at MIT and with partners elsewhere. Leaders interested in systems, how to make them more humane, more compassionate and generative. And today's particular focus, how to re-engineer systems so that they deliver fair and equitable opportunity to everyone. We have a long way to go on that. Our overall premise is that education can be a leading sector in helping shape cultural changes that we need throughout society, and that educational innovators around the world recognize more and more that they need to understand and work at multiple levels and with multiple constituencies within dynamic and complex social systems. If we think about the most pressing issues of our time, from climate change to equity, to democracy, to health and well-being, a fundamental question is, how can we create deep and sustained change in the systems that shape our lives? Along the way, we need tools to identify and document critical indicators of success in systems change over the long haul. We need frameworks and narratives and empirical studies that will ground the work. So we want to ask what kind of research can help to tell a story that often seems very abstract, but could not be more urgent or more vivid in hundreds of thousands of daily lives. Before we begin, we want to thank our MIT co-organizers, Open Learning, J-WEL, the Abdul, Latif, Jameel World Education Lab, and the Comparative Media Studies Writing Department in the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. We also want to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Stewart Foundation for generous support of this series and of the emerging systems awareness research community at MIT. In the first of our conversations in January, and I hope many of you were there, we heard from Peter Senge, Meta Bol, and Eric Klopper about how their work has brought them to this point, these 3 collaborators who've brought us here today, how they've come to this point and what they hope may emerge from this new collaborative community. We began to point to key questions and ideas that we will want to explore together as colleagues interested in systems change in education. Today, we continue that exploration. My role is to moderate. Peter and I go back a long way in a whole range of efforts that touch on many of these themes. I'm an advisor to Meta and Peter's Center for Systems Awareness, an occasional auditor of their Master Practitioners Training Program, and a regular reviewer of participants' final portfolios for certification in that program. I know it well, I admire it greatly. As president of Wellesley College for 14 years, I developed an approach to leadership that emphasized systems awareness. It's been part of my thinking for most of my career. I've also been deeply involved at MIT for many decades, for 2 decades, on the corporation, as their trustees at MIT, its small executive committee, as a chair of many visiting and advisory committees, and now as a life member emerita of the corporation. At MIT, systems awareness and systems change are a special strength and a fundamental underpinning of the Institute's aims in the world of education and beyond, in the future of learning and beyond that, and a number of the Institute's visions for a better world. MIT just finished a massive campaign dedicated to a better world. And of course, Peter's life's work is essential to that story, understanding and changing systems for the better. So I want to ask Meta first and Peter to say a quick word about who you are, why you're here, why you've brought the rest of us here. Meta?
Yeah, thank you so much, Diana. And welcome everyone. I'm delighted to see people that I haven't seen for a long time, some new faces and a lot of folks that I know well. And it's always wonderful to engage in conversation about these important topics with a sense of community coming together and really exploring together how we can shift some of the trajectories. My quick introduction. I think those of you who were here on our last call about a month ago, of course, will have heard a much longer version of this, but a quick pass is I'm the executive director of the Center for Systems Awareness. I have worked with Peter and Diana and others for the last decade to bring this compassionate systems framework that we work with in education in many different places in the world into manifestation. I'm a visiting scientist a research scientist at MIT, and our hope is that the next phase of the work will really be, beginning to develop the type of research that's needed in order for us to not try to reduce the complexity of something like the system of education, which is by its very nature incredibly complex and very, very hard to study in a kind of a linear way. So we need to figure out ways of approaching and understanding this system better so that we might redesign it for very different outcomes than what we see today, where so many of our young people are not thriving at all, and so many of our educators are not thriving either. And that's why we're just delighted to have Michael McAfee and Larissa joining us here today, because they are two of our friends and colleagues in the broader community of researchers and advisors that are really, essential voices to bring into this conversation from onset on, knowing that we don't hold the answers to what needs to happen, but we will need to come together with many different perspectives in order to think together on how to create the changes that are needed for human flourishing. So,
thank you. Meta, perfect. Thanks so much. Peter, who are you anyway? Where are you?
Oh, I'm someone who's been hanging around MIT until they kick me out. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And I'll just say a word about, the obvious, which is it's pretty hard to talk about the challenges and deep change in education without talking about equity and well-being. So we're really happy to have Michael and Larissa join us today, because those terms are used a lot, and I think that's really a good thing. You could have had conversations about the need to reform education 10, 20 years ago, and you wouldn't have stumbled on these two words. And yet today, I don't think you can start any serious conversation without talking about the well-being of kids and teachers, and without recognizing the extraordinary challenges of inequity in our contemporary society, in which school is kind of obviously embedded. So I won't say any more, because we'd really like to hear a little more from Michael and Larissa, both of whom in different ways are really exceptional leaders in these domains. Diana?
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. So as Peter said, our theme today is equity, broadly speaking. Equity, which Michael, one of our speakers, approaches through public policies designed to lift the 100 million people, the majority of whom are people of color, who live in or near poverty. Equity, which our other speaker, Larissa Duncan, advances in research and interventions designed to bring mindfulness and compassion into parenting and pregnancy, healthy families and schools and medical settings. Equity, how do we define it? How do we study it? How do we advance it across all levels of society? Our focus for today. Both speakers have been sources of advice, as you've heard, and wisdom to Meta and Peter, and sources of inspiration really to us all. I've been reading up on them, and it's been a great pleasure in these weeks before this session, and can say with confidence that we're in for a treat. I won't take a lot of time in lengthy introductions. You can find a lot of interest about them both on the web, which I've been doing, but just a quick word. So Dr. Michael McAfee is president and CEO of PolicyLink. You could find that website. Excuse me, he's profiled there. A number of his major speeches and writings are there. They're extensive and they're impressive. I enjoy delving into them. What I took away is this, that he is leading a social movement. He's gathering other organizations into a powerful social movement. He is in it for the long haul, even as he is driven by the urgency of now. Before becoming CEO, he was the inaugural director of Promise Neighborhoods, place-based approaches to transforming the life options of people who have been left behind by a civil society, these are his words, satisfied with providing charity when the path to equity requires structural systems change. So PolicyLink brings comprehensive tools to support honest and deep assessment of results and work to create a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. He'll tell us more, and you'll hear that Michael is advancing this win with equity agenda with deep compassion. Dr. Larissa Duncan is all about compassion too, and all about equity. She has several faculty appointments in human development and family studies, including an endowed chair at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is internationally known for a framework she has developed to assess and document results, and she conducts and supervises research that traces pathways toward health and equity and well-being that run from biological and psychological impacts of contemplative practices through child and family well-being and to social equity on larger scales. Well, you've heard enough from me. Here's our plan. For the first hour, we'll have a conversation, starting with opening thoughts from our two speakers, then a give and take discussion, and I'll bring Peter and Meta back in. Eric wasn't able to be here today, Eric Klopper, but he will be here next for our next two sessions. And then for the last half hour, we'll have breakout groups as we did last time. And as they start, I'll lay out our very simple plan for them. But for now, let's get into it. So Michael, as I said, it was a pleasure to get to know you on the web. And now we have you in person. Well, sort of online. As you introduce yourself, it would be fascinating to have, among other things, your sense of your blend of optimism that we in the US may be approaching a true breaking open of our horrific legacy of racism, but also your sense that it isn't going to happen overnight, and why, and what needs to happen to accelerate it, and how might that inform our conversations today, or whatever you want to say to us. Welcome, it's so good to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be with you all. Good morning, everyone. I am extremely optimistic and hopeful in this moment, even though it's a tough moment. I'm hopeful because the reality is you've never had all three sectors come to racial equity in America like we have now. Civil society, government, and corporate America have come to something that they've avoided for years. And that's a big deal. But at the same time, you have a nation that has just taken a significant hit on a ranking of stable democracies. And in many ways, we're taking that hit because we can't see the humanity of folks who are poor or look like me. And I come to the compassionate systems frame, having been doing a lot of systems work my entire career, and having come to the realization over the last couple of years that the results that I would want to achieve can't be achieved. And that's why I make the distinction between charity and doing the liberatory acts that would design a different nation. You know, you can love this country and also acknowledge its origin story. And think about the power of research that would answer this question. What is the end game for a nation founded on stolen land, slave labor, and genocide that has never chosen to really apologize for it? Never really chosen to change the legal and regulatory basis by which the nation was founded and constructed around those systems of beliefs. And then the thing that it never has loved is actually getting ready to become the majority in that nation. What happens to that nation? That's where we are at now. Some people say 2035 or sooner. Some people say 2040. The nation will be a nation of color in many places right now, not the entire nation. The majority of children born are children of color. And I share that not because that matters beyond the fact that it's causing a great deal of tension in this nation. I share it because it is an exciting opportunity for us all to think about what does it take for us finally to live into this multiracial democracy that is a gift of ours. Because what I know is simply the color of your skin does not guarantee us that this nation is going to get better just because it becomes a nation of color. But there is a societal competency that I think would be transformative if we acquired it en masse. And that is the compassionate systems framework. I mean, think about how many of our institutions right now can't see the humanity of everyday people. Just can't see it, can't serve. I wish some of you all would call around in your community today and say you're homeless and watch what happens. Say you don't have food and you need to eat and see what happens. Call up institutions that have great brand that are revered and see what happens. See if you could get help today. Our institutions have forgotten how to serve and how to serve those most in need. And John Gardner warned us about this, that institutions that can't shake off the husk of complacency and to continue to evolve and renew would fail. And you're seeing so many of our institutions fail today. I mean, think about it. How do you put trillions of dollars out and miss everyday people in America in a pandemic? How does that happen? How do you start one of the biggest economic development opportunities, new programs, and missed everyday people? Opportunity zones, PPP. While women around the nation, the world, were showing us what it looked like to care for workers and subsidize wages, here in America, we were arguing about whether folks deserve $300 a month. Think about that. Because we think they're shiftless and lazy. And here's the thing about that 100 million, 48% of it is white. 48% of that 100 million is white. And the opportunity for a person that looks like me is finally to help this nation govern for the all. In the equity definition, it doesn't say Black folks. Our definition of equity is just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. And the all is the operative word for me. Because if I can't see the humanity of folks who do not look like me, there is no chance for the nation to get better. And that is the work for our generation. And that's why I'm so excited. Because, you know, before the pandemic, I was on the road 60 or 70% of the time for about 9 years. And I got to see all sorts of parts of this country, all sorts of people. And the thing that I know is something is special. Something special is happening. I've seen leaders transform their companies by beginning to see other people's humanity. I've watched individuals go through their own personal transformation, go through their own organizational transformation, and watching them think about what they want to do in community. We're working with a group of CEOs from some of the biggest companies in America right now, and watching them actually authentically come to this work, trying to figure it out in their companies is huge. This wouldn't have happened years ago. Folks wouldn't have touched PolicyLink because we believe we have to talk about race. And compassionate systems is a way to address race. You know, we talk about race because anti-Black racism has caused us to build things that no longer work for any of us. You know, in the Bay where I live, middle-class folks of every hue are upset because while they may make $200,000 a year plus, they still struggle to afford their rent or mortgage in private school. Now think about why they have to go to take their kids to private school. Their kids have to go to private school because we gave up on the public option of education. We said that's a public good we can continue to disinvest in because we don't want to be educated next to people like me. My parents took me out of school when they started busing. My parents gave up on education for one reason, because they just wanted their baby to have a good education. Other folks gave up on it because they didn't want to have their kids in a classroom next to me. Nevertheless, the nation gave up on public education. And in so many places, folks with buying options say to themselves, you know, for my kids, that's not the best option. How tragic is that? How tragic is that? And because of a decision that was made on race, middle-class folks today who had nothing to do with that decision suffer from it. And if you read a book like The Color of Law, you'll see the elegant design of how education in California was constructed purely on race. Entire communities designed around educational infrastructure purely on race. And so while we all would like race to go away, it goes away when we can see what it has created and we can set about the business of fixing it. And so that's why the compassionate systems frame is so important. I think it is a bridge from race to seeing the all in the equity definition. It is an opportunity for us to think about how can all of our institutions, our laws, our regulations, our customs, how can they be refreshed for what we have now? A beautiful, vibrant, multiracial democracy where we all need to see each other's humanity. And the last thing I'll say is this. This is the nation building work that we must do. This is nation building work. It's not a boutique frame. If we don't get this as a societal competence, we will never achieve the results that we want. We can be as technical as we want. We can be as smart as we want. But we have reached a point where smarts and technical sophistication are no match for what we've constructed. What is a match for it is that love in your heart, married with deep technical competence and an intellect that can see a way forward for transforming our schools, our health systems, our governments, ultimately this nation. So I want you to hold, while people think these words are soft, I think the most powerful thing you can do is to love someone else and to design spaces that are a manifestation of your love because they can belong in them. They can bring their full selves to those places. That's not soft work. And if that doesn't work for you, just understand this. While this nation has made significant progress, that 100 million number is real. And I think that, you know, people like to say the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. I don't think that that happens automatically. I think it happens if folks like you and me, we take up our agency to enact a different possibility. And that's what the compassionate systems frame is asking us to do, to enact a different possibility where all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. So it's good to be with you this morning.
Michael, I can't thank you enough. Just so beautiful and inspiring. So now we turn to Larissa. We're giving her a hard act to follow, but she's completely equal to it. Our goal, as we've said, with this new MIT hosted community, really the underlying goal of it, in addition to what Michael said about taking up this huge opportunity to craft a better world. Our goal is to bring research into conversation with practice in new and more fruitful ways, to begin to tell a story in much more compelling and important ways. And you do that in your work. You combine these two worlds, you bridge these two worlds, and it's not easy because the two worlds have different assumptions and values and incentives and rewards. So it's really important that we hear from you about how you're managing that, what you're doing. And also, if you'd like to give us a sense of some of the challenges in doing that. And if you have thoughts about our dream for this community, this collaborative community with this vision that Michael has just so beautifully articulated, and how that could be of support to you and your graduate students and your colleagues who are really forging this path of a different kind of research approach to these very big questions. So thank you for being here. It's all yours.
Thank you, Diana. It is a pleasure to be with you all this morning. And Michael, just a deep, deep bow of gratitude for you, for your visionary work and perspective and giving voice to this other way that's possible, for the truly liberatory approach that must be taken, as you've said, to rebuild a nation anew with the possibility that exists when we really understand what our tremendous strengths are possible given the diversity of the hearts and minds that are present, that Black and brown folks who have suffered tremendously from systemic oppression, from racism, from white supremacy, from this tremendous fallacy of the myth of meritocracy in our society. I was, as an undergraduate student, faced that and really deeply felt a need to do work that could contribute to understanding the causes and conditions of that 100 million in poverty, to thinking about what we might do to shift hearts and minds. So I really want to encourage everyone here to just pause with me for a moment. I'm feeling, my words are not quite as articulate as I might hope. And I'm realizing that it's partly what's going on with me after really being moved by what Michael had to say. So I'd like to invite us to pause and really feel into what becomes possible if we embrace the vision that Michael has set forth for us this morning. And then I'd be glad to answer as best I can some of your questions, Diana, and to think together about how this wonderful center at MIT and the work around the world around compassionate systems change might be work that we can all engage in to do that liberatory work. So let's pause for just a moment and really take in what we've heard, what might be possible if we lift up and begin to study what love looks like and what's possible when we really regard one another's true humanity. What did you notice in your mind, in your heart, in your body as you were listening to Michael? Something I noticed within myself was a desire to act, to do something, of the urgency of this, right? And I've done a lot of work over the past decade, 2 decades, to look at my own whiteness and my own tendency towards a white saviorism that really leads into that charity stream of work that Michael identified. So I've been working on dismantling that within myself and really coming to a more humble place of what do I have to learn and what is my own unique contribution that could be part of the relationships that I'm in with my students, with my colleagues in higher education, with clinicians and teachers with whom we work. And then how can I use the skills and training and understanding that I have, that technical ability as a research scholar, to tell those stories, to capture the processes that are happening, the innovation that's happening, the creativity that's happening when I do what I can do, which is to hold space for some of that work. It's not my own work, but what I can do is hold space, and I can offer tools, and I can get resources that are available to me given the tremendous privileges that I have, many of which are simply because I'm white. So I moved from the San Francisco Bay Area almost 7 years ago to Wisconsin to take a job focused on child and family well-being. And I learned at that time in 2015, based on data from the Annie E. Casey Foundation's Kids Count data, that Wisconsin had the worst racial disparities in our entire nation on a whole host of indicators of child and family well-being, and a hallmark indicator being preterm birth. Black babies die in Wisconsin at a disproportionate rate to white babies. That is horrifying. If we really look at those numbers and think about each of those individual human beings and their families, and then the impact on the whole community, we're talking death. So when we think about biological systems, what are those hallmark indicators telling us that something is wrong, very, very wrong? And there were these indicators, and what was being done about it? These were the questions that I had, and I felt this call to come and do what I could. The quote, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. And so I entered into this system of the University of Wisconsin, as well as the University of Wisconsin Cooperative Extension System. It's a land grant university. And part of what I really dug into was the history of land grant universities. So they are a tremendous example of colonization, of the theft of land from Native peoples, the indigenous peoples of this continent, and the resources then are used to fund this university. And not only that, this cooperative extension system was created that funded educators in communities to go out and teach the white immigrant farmers how to best profit from and use that land that was stolen and then given to them. And so this is the genocidal and racist history of the university. And so how do we work within these kinds of systems that we're in higher education in a truly liberatory way, right? We heard terms this morning like re-engineer. To re-engineer, I think first we need to reimagine. We need to have an entirely different vision of what is possible. And we're limited by our own training, by the frameworks that have been provided to us. We can only research what we can, suspect may exist or may be happening. We are limited by the questions that we ask, by the measurement tools that we use. And I am becoming more and more aware of the ways in which I can't see, and I am limited, and I want to envision these possibilities. I want to create a bridge. I want to create a space for this kind of work to happen. And so I shifted my work from the broader, big scale dissemination of evidence-based programs to support child and family well-being to focusing on who was coming into our graduate program, what our admissions policies were, who might come and do PhD work that could add this credential, could add this training, could add these skills to important social change efforts they were already engaging in. And so I now have the tremendous honor of having PhD students working with me who are women of color, who were already doing tremendous community-based work, were already leaders in their communities. And now, as part of their doctoral research, they are doing what has been set out as the charge for your center of asking new questions and using innovative methods and really driving the research from the community of having, for example, frontline community health workers and doulas who are Latinx and Indigenous immigrants to the US, who are Black women who are part of the grassroots efforts to shift this horrific statistic around preterm birth and Black infant mortality in Wisconsin. And these students are now working together, bridging racial ethnic divides and tensions in our community that come about from another fallacy, which is this perspective of that they must compete against one another for precious resources to achieve, equitable success for their community. And so I'll put links to a couple of these organizations in the chat. One is Roots for Change. Raíces Para el Cambio. And this is a cooperative formed by these immigrant women. And then another is Harambe Village, which is founded by Black women who are working as doulas. And so I know you all are focused largely on education systems, and I have done some of that work, but continually come to this place of prevention and going to the root causes and conditions that lead to these disparities that prevent equitable functioning in our societies. And so, as I said, that hallmark indicator of preterm birth, if we changed every aspect of our systems that leads to disparities in preterm birth, we would see a lot of beneficial change downstream for children in their lives, for families, for teachers who are often themselves parents. So I want to encourage you all to be thinking about the families and the community-based work as you think about next steps for your study of compassionate systems change in education. And one, last little example. So Mariela Quesada Centeno, who is the person who really championed the coming together of those community health workers and doulas, the Latinx and Indigenous women, and Tia Murray, who founded Harambe Village, co-founded it, came together and came to me with a grant possibility, a potential of a $5 million approximate award that could be given out by the Health Research Services Administration to address exactly this issue of preterm birth and Black infant mortality. And they said, we can imagine lots of white professors and academic medicine researchers at the School of Medicine and Public Health being the appropriate principal investigators to go after this type of funding. But we would like to convene a meeting and have it be led by these doulas and community health workers who have been training with us, who were recipients of our services and are now themselves leading the organization. They are the ones who have the vision. They are the ones who know what's needed. They have the appropriate questions for us to understand what processes and changes are needed. And it's just business as usual to have the people in positions of power do what they always do and apply for these grants and get the money and do what they've been doing, which led us to this place where we are the worst in the nation. And so they asked for my assistance with convening this meeting, with getting the people in the room. And we had a meeting to kick off this process of writing a grant with 40, of the bigwigs from the university and state public health associations, the people who would normally be the ones to go after these funds. And we created a platform for these doulas and community health workers to tell their stories and to put forth their vision for what could be. And people listened. And we created a vehicle for going after these funds. And I wish I could tell you that we were awarded the funds, and we were not. Our grant had a perfect score in every single section except one, which was the evaluation section. And it was required that we had an external evaluator. And there was only one agency in our state that the community was comfortable with because it was led by a Black woman. And the reviewers would not accept her liberatory evaluation framework. And so the score of that portion of our grant is the reason why we did not have a perfect score and we were not awarded the funds. So I want to invite you all to think about this question of starting where you are, using what you have, and doing what you can. What needs to happen to shift that reality? What needs to happen to hold space for the visionaries who I think are those community-based leaders who know what's happening, who know what's needed, and how can we create room within our systems of education so that their voices are centered, so that they have the resources that we need, and so that our research can be as liberatory as the practice that has already started to happen. We're behind in the questions we ask and the tools we use for research and evaluation, and that's a problem. So I'm excited to be with you all. I'm excited to think through these challenges further and to work together. Thank you.
Larissa, thank you so much. What an amazing story. Beautiful, beautiful story. So beautifully told. I knew this was going to be a great session. I didn't understand concretely the ways in which it would be. It's really remarkable. So there's so many ways to follow up. First of all, I regret that they didn't have the wisdom to fund this project. But as Michael's been saying, you know, there's the urgency of now, but there's also the commitment for the long haul. And I know that's a very important part of who you are, Larissa, you both are. So I want to bring Meta and Peter in for a minute. Why don't I start with you, Meta, as you've listened to these stories from two people you knew would bring us such wisdom. How do you reflect on it? You had commented earlier that coming from a different country without the same history that we Americans are carrying, that we've just been hearing about. You've had to learn about how to make sense of this crazy country of ours. How do you, anywhere you want to go with this?
Yeah, thank you, Diana. It is interesting in that sense. My dad was an American and my mom's Danish, and I grew up in Denmark, but had, you know, spent a lot of my childhood time in the United States. But my institutionalization happened in Scandinavia, right? And so it took me a long time to adjust, even though I felt, you know, I feel properly American in some parts. And, you know, I have a lot of American family. I've spent a lot of time in the United States and so on and so forth. In many ways, I feel more at home with the American kind of, you know, the many of the aspects of the American culture works better for me than the Scandinavian one does, and so on. But it took me a long time when working in this domain to understand how we all internalize the systems that we live in, and not having grown up in with this, you know, with systemic oppression in quite the same way as we see in the United States, because obviously Scandinavia is designed very differently, and there's much less of a kind of a gap between people that come from different places, and it's also a much more homogeneous society, generally speaking, the population. So it's just been very, very interesting. Michael has certainly been a great friend and partner in all this. So every time I would stumble into something, not understanding how to best navigate this space, it has been a great learning opportunity for me, because every time we encounter something that we don't really understand, it's always an invitation for us to begin to explore our own mental models, right? Why is this weird to me? Why don't I understand what's going on here? And I'm sometimes not the fastest learner, really. So it took me a few rounds, and I'm not sure I'm there yet. It's probably going to be a lifelong journey, but I've come to understand a few things, and it's actually quite helpful being, I think it's quite helpful being able to kind of apply an external lens sometime and looking in at the society, because there are so many things, there are so many incredible and amazing things in the United States. And there's so many things that needs healing, like profound restorative practices applied to the very fabric of people coming together in public institutions, for example, like school, which is why I think working in education is really very meaningful. And I'm just delighted to hear from you both. And one of the things that struck me in this conversation now is how readily you both use the word love, which traditionally, at least in the academic traditions I was brought up in, would be a kind of a matter of ridicule almost. If I was to talk about love as a scientist, I'm like, you know, might as well just carry around a sign saying I'm not a real scientist after all. And it's always been so damn weird to me, because clearly we're quite motivated by this thing, right? Look at all literature and all the movies and all the music and all the arts and, you know, all the expressions of love, and how much at the forefront of what is important for us that is. And now we're in a conversation where the L word is being used quite frequently and broadly. And it seems to me that's the real paradigm shift. And so I'm just, that was the primary kind of just joy of listening to you both. And I just feel so honored and really humbled to be able to be on this journey with you all. And for us to create a community of like-minded people who can bring all the diversity of perspectives that are needed in order for us to redesign the fabric of society. I think the L word sits right at the heart of that. So thank you so much to both of you for bringing that in.
So Peter, let me bring you in, and this was to be a conversation between the four of you. So, and we're running short on time, but Peter, go ahead.
I think that I would like to just kind of reflect for a moment on what Meta just said, and then turn it back to Larissa and Michael, because it turned out to be quite kind of catalytic in the evolution of all of our work in compassion systems to actually get a definition of love that really worked. And the one we eventually came from a wonderful mentor, very eminent Chilean biologist named Humberto Maturana, who defines love as the act of allowing another to be a legitimate other. The act of allowing another to be a legitimate other. It feels to me with this very simple phrase, we kind of come right back to where Michael started us off. What's it take to see the humanity? What does it really take for us to build the capacity to see the humanity in one another? And how could that really be in many ways the seed crystal for the transformation of so many of our key institutions? So I just like to give it back to Larissa and Michael for any further reflections you have on this journey that lies ahead.
And Peter, you were asking me to dive in. I'm sitting in a hangar waiting for a flight, and the jet is coming. The jet is coming by now.
Well, you don't have to use the metaphor too literally.
But Peter, if you could repeat the question succinctly for Michael didn't get it, I think.
So I think this notion that we're kind of coming back to legitimating the use of love as citizens, as researchers, as people who are really trying to get their arms around the complexity of the challenges we face. The obvious first question is, what the hell do we mean by love? And our kind of anchor notion in romantic love and sentimental love, to me, it becomes a real problem. And that's why I shared this definition of Humberto's, which has been so useful for us. The act of allowing another to be a legitimate other. And yes. I think that it revitalizes this and opens up this path. It was the same one you pointed to at the beginning.
That's right. I agree with that definition. And the only thing I would add to it is the ability then to act in service of another to alleviate suffering as a manifestation of that definition. And, even in my own office, people kind of laugh or like roll their eyes, because in some ways my exterior is very hard. And then I use the word and it's kind of like it just doesn't go for folks. But the reality is it is actually not for them. It is for me. It is me speaking into existence what I want to model. A friend of mine says that the self is an instrument that should be played beautifully. And all of our jobs, before we worry about the system's work, is to understand our contribution to the system. And for me, if I don't show up thinking about loving and thinking about alleviating suffering, then it is too easy for me to become intoxicated by the trappings of this role that I'm in. I could give speeches all around the country and do conferences and write papers and everybody would love me. But the fundamental thing, there would be still a problem. Nobody's better off. And so it keeps me from getting seduced by titles and roles and to stay clear about what my task is. That 100 million is my population. It's not just PolicyLink's population. And what that allows me to do is to not sit back at the end of the year and say, well, I was the CEO of PolicyLink and I went to the White House and the White House talked to me. And then I got to go to the business roundtable, and I get to be in all these rooms and all these places. But in service of what? In service of what? And there's no need to judge anybody else's way of being. That the word may not work for them. But for me, what I've come to fully embrace in my spirit is that the other stuff doesn't work. It's cold and it's sterile and it's void of humanity. And so, yeah, use all these technical and foreign words, but to still not have a commitment to alleviating suffering. I mean, think about all the systems change work that people say they're doing. And yet they're not oriented to alleviating human suffering. What are you doing then? What are you really doing? And so for me, that's why I use that word, because the action that I want to take and the legacy that I want to leave is a nation in which that 100 million plus is actually better off. They're not suffering like they are today. I mean, imagine in most places in this country, you could work 2 jobs and still be in poverty. That's not a compassionate system. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Larissa, did you want to jump in on Peter's question or this question of love?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Peter, and thank you, Michael, for this quote, "The self is an instrument that should be played beautifully." Right. And this, Meta, your comment about love and being taken seriously as a scientist, right? I think that people are paralyzed often by these conventions of our systems, and our systems are violent. And so how can we shift our approach and our perspective such that each of the selves who show up can be played beautifully, that can offer what they uniquely have to contribute? And so, yeah, I started my work with mindful parenting, really thinking about that relationship between a parent or a caregiver and a child. Your opening slide when we started this session was someone who looked like an adult figure kneeling down, facing a child, holding their hands and looking into their face. And the child's face is not visible because a hood is covering it. But that adult was seeing that child, really being present with them, and had a smile on their face that the child could see if their eyes were open. And so holding that space for that child and allowing that child to unfold as the sovereign being that they are, that was the initial work I was doing with mindful parenting. And then began to see how it's all about relationships. So that parent-child relationship, but then that teacher-student relationship, that doctor-patient relationship, and how can it be less hierarchical, less power-driven, but relationship-centered and person-centered. The humanists, Carl Rogers and some of his students, talk about all work gets done in relationships. So if it's a massive policy to affect 100 million people, the work to make that change is in relationships. If it's shifting the space that's held for one child to allow them to be better regulated, to participate in a classroom, it's the relationship that's going to allow that to happen, not rules, not power, not control, not domination. And so how do we really think about our relationship with ourself, our body, mind, heart, as I asked you to reflect on, as I was noticing mine was really stimulated by what we heard from Michael. And so what I try to do with my students is see them the way that adult saw that child, but not in a hierarchical way, as I have different experience, different skills that I can share to our collaboration, and you do as well. And I have so much to learn from you. And that is loving them. That is allowing them to love me. And what I wish counted on my faculty review each year is the student who says, the process of proposing my dissertation with you was healing. It allowed me to understand myself better and to propose a new way of doing research and work that truly uplifts my community. that allows us to be who we really are and not hide so that we can survive in this violent system. So that's the last bit I'll share.
Oh, thank you. We could go on all day. I wish we could, actually. But that's why we're trying to build this community, because we can come back and back and back and continue these conversations that are just so inspiring and so important. It's my responsibility now to move us along. We said we were going to have breakout groups. We've got a large number of participants, and we want to make sure everybody gets a chance to process a little bit of this. So we're going to invite people to do a little bit of journaling on the question of how do these themes and questions relate to my own work? How do these themes and questions we've been discussing this morning relate to my own work? And I will now invite comments from anyone who wants to raise your hand and indicate you'd like to speak. So I'd like to hear how the conversation went. And if there was a question or a theme that emerged in your check-in that you think others might benefit from hearing that you'd like to share, I'd be happy to call on you for that. And we'll do that for a little while. Then we had an impromptu breakout group of our two speakers and our two leaders and myself. And there was an interesting question from that I think I'll present as we close. So let's see, do I see any hands? I'm not yet seeing hands. Anatoly Babinia, did you wish to be recognized? No.
Oh yeah. Okay, I can speak a bit.
Very good. Go for it.
Yeah. So my interest was if the work with the children can help the adults as well, because I see that there is a growing burnout among my friends, among like my peers, and I was thinking that children can feel this too, because right now we are all synchronized and no more isolated thanks to the internet and discussions. So one of the other things that struck me is that we discussed like an interesting idea that then if educators like see, or like adults see little people as some wonders, those little people feel themselves as wonders and also start to behave in this way, start to be more open about exploring the world around them. So that was really, really interesting idea.
Little people as wonders. That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to bring anything into the larger group? Yeah, well, there we go. Claudia.
Thank you. Happy to maybe say a couple of things about discussion I ended up with someone I know for a while now, Julia Ross. And one of the things that we were discussing is, what it means to be a practitioner of the work. And my reaction, even though we're not, we might not be directly involved with, work that, benefits kids or parents, my reaction was this work needs to be present in everyone's lives when we onboard people, when we make decisions about funding resources, allocation, when we even make that decision on a grant, like we heard before. I feel like this work has to be maybe is invisible, is so much part of who we are, but is necessary. So that was sort of a lot of our conversation that, I wanted to share. So it was wonderful to connect with someone I know and had not had the opportunity to talk to for a while.
Thank you, Claudia. Very, very helpful insight. Anybody else?
Just a short
Peter.
reflection on that phrase, little people. I was really struck by that.
I love that.
Little people as wonders. And just pondering the use of that phrase versus children, kids. I often think that, one of the fundamental, in a funny way, equity issues, it definitely is an equity issue. It's not something we usually label that way, is this kind of wall we build between the adults and the children. And it's very often in the language we use. When I heard that phrase, little people, I was immediately recalled the fact that when you translate literally a lot of native languages in English, You end up saying stone people, tree people, grass people. You kind of add the word people to all these other kind of fellow beings we travel along with. And of course, in doing that, in talking about the tree people, all of a sudden there's a leveling. And it dawned on me that people, beside the fact that maybe it could get misused as like leprechauns or something, but just talking about children as little people kind of brings us on to the same.
There's also an affection in it. It conveys a heart connection. Those little people that we love so dearly. Yeah, it's beautiful. Thank you. That's a great point. So we had this really interesting conversation about love and how we define love as we were doing collectively, and the issue of seeing people's humanity and seeing their suffering. That we see that, you know, that we have to see the suffering, but we don't want to go to the charity impulse. And so the question was that emerged was, there's that instant when we see the suffering in another or another group, maybe very distant from us, and we feel it. But what happens in that instant? And what happens after that first instant? And people, of course, shut down and have all kinds of ways of going into defensive postures and not taking the next step. So the question is, what helps people expand that space, that instant of shared humanity, of recognition that the suffering I see over there is in me too and everyone I know? What happens in that space, and how can we help people stay there longer, not look away so quickly? And we thought it'd be interesting to ask our two guests today to kind of reflect on that. And I see, Larissa, that's an important part of your work, I know.
Thank you, Diana. And I was really struck by something Michael said around, you know, his definition of love and what I think is really the embodiment of compassion, to act in service of another to alleviate suffering. And so as you mentioned, Diana, we were thinking about that moment of when people experience that flash of empathy Peter described, when they really come face to face with the suffering. And so that's a decision point. That's an opportunity to join that arc toward justice and really engage and do something, or to shut down and do nothing out of overwhelm or guilt or an unwillingness or an inability or a lack of skill for being with what's hard and painful to sit with. And I saw a quote the other day of, you know, inaction is doing something. Inaction is maintaining the system as it is. And when we have an inequitable system, that shutting down, that inaction is a choice, is an act, is in fact upholding the system in the way that it's functioning. And so if we wish to re-engineer, or first to reimagine this system, we must cultivate the skill to be with that suffering. And that's where the contemplative practices such as mindfulness and compassion and loving kindness meditation that now have, you know, pretty solid empirical evidence, including, you know, brain changes, physiological changes. But one of our key forms of stress that produces a reliable physiological stress response as human beings is social evaluative threat, of feeling we're not going to be accepted by those around us. And for those of us in positions of power in these systems with the way they are, we face a tremendous amount of social evaluative threat with sometimes real consequences if we do something different, if we get on that arc towards justice, right? So what is going to give us the courage to act compassionately?
Thank you. Thank you. Great point. Meta or Peter, do you want to jump in on this?
I'm mindful that there is a raised hand. Farishta?
Farishta's iPhone.
Yeah, thank you so much for the space. I really appreciate it. I think I just have one quick comment talking about alleviating suffering and seeing people's humanity and suffering. I think as an Afghan woman, of course, I would like to add that the world at this point, at this critical point for Afghan women, needs to stand with them and show their support, not only just because like Afghans are not having the right to their fundamental, the access to their fundamental rights as right to education and work, but just as fellow human beings, as women who are suffering on daily basis, who are tortured, those who are in position, those who are in power to advocate for them and just hear to their stories and try to do what they can from their end. I think that's something I wanted to just share. Thank you.
Thank you, Farishta. Thank you for bringing that in. You're right. That's one of the places that I think we all are seeing every day when we pick up the newspapers, the tremendous suffering. And the question is how to hold it. And you've helped us do that by reminding us. We appreciate that very much. Thank you. Anybody else want to bring something in at this point? Opening a space, just in case. Silences are sometimes uncomfortable, but sometimes out of the silence comes something that needed to be heard. Okay, well.
I'm happy to share another thought that I feel like I deal with every time. Like, what are the frameworks? Like, even that lens of compassion is necessary when we're going to bring to someone's attention, you know, the inequality and help them and equip them maybe with a better way to think about our privilege and how to deal with it. It is uncomfortable. But I feel like I personally react in ways that I'm not necessarily bringing the positive, but pushing people away and not having that uncomfortable conversation. So yeah, Julia and I spoke about that. I offer an article that I read recently that gave me a framework to do that in a better way. So that's one of my to-dos, you know, engage people in a positive conversation that helps them maybe understand our privilege and maybe start thinking about ways to do things in different ways. Yeah.
It's a great point. It's very hard to do it alone, to hold those really difficult, challenging moments alone. We need to do it in company with others.
Yeah, in ways that are respectful and also allowing myself to be in the position of others to understand why they react the way they react. But yeah, so it's one goal that I have for myself.
Good.
I'm kind of holding a quiet joy in a sense that we're able to come together and have conversations like this across time zones and virtually and all that, but also really mindful that it's hosted within MIT. And I don't think that there's any better institution actually in the world than, you know, as a kind of as a nesting space or a kind of a cultivating space for engaging in, you know, this endeavor towards systems change that really has a deep commitment to compassion woven into all of the different facets of change that we aspire to see. So it's just really very joyful for me. And thank you everyone who's here and contributing. And yeah. Larissa and Michael, of course, we're going to keep you very close.
Yes, very, 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 very grateful for both of you for getting us going. You know, I think it's so countercultural, as we've been saying, some of what this vision that we have for a very, very different society and world that leads from the heart and from human connection and goes from there to thinking in this very broad and analytical way about systems and the ways in which they diminish our humanity. And our ability just to sit here for a few minutes in silence and wait to see what's coming up as part of the commitment to doing things differently.
Mm.
It's a remarkable community, Peter and Meta, that you've been nurturing and supporting. Very grateful to all of you for being here with us today. We will continue. The recording of this session will be available to everyone. We'll send it out, and the chat, the data from the chat, you'll get that too. We have 2 more sessions. The next one, as you see here on the screen, is on March 17th. Population level data in support of well-being and compassionate systems change. So that will be a next step and an important one. So please be sure to register if you're not registered, because that way you get the recording and the announcements. And again, just such deep gratitude to everyone here for bringing yourselves so fully into this really important conversation and this community that I think will continue to evolve and emerge and redefine reality in really important ways. So thank you. Special thanks to Michael and Larissa, Peter and Meta.
Thank you so much, you too.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.